October 14th, 2001. A quiet autumn evening in rural Indiana, the kind that should have been filled with the scent of burning leaves and the distant laughter of children playing in yards. But for the Miller family, the day ended in terror. 12-year-old Emily and her 8-year-old brother Nathan were last seen playing in their front yard, just as the sun dipped behind the rolling hills. By nightfall, panic had set in. Their mother, Linda Miller, had caught the children inside for dinner, but the yard was empty. No Emily, no Nathan, only the faint sound of wind rustling through the maples lining the street. Neighbors reported seeing the children around 5:30 p.m., laughing, chasing each other across the lawn, their dog trailing behind. By 6 p.m., when their mother checked again, the children had vanished. The initial response was frantic. Local police canvassed the neighborhood, alerting every household, searching nearby woods, barns, and the creek that ran behind the property. State police were called in as night fell, but despite hours of searching, there was no trace, no footprints, no witnesses, nothing. The Miller family's grief was immediate and consuming. Linda could not comprehend how her children, so full of life just moments ago, could vanish into thin air. Her husband, Robert, a factory worker accustomed to long hours and tough shifts, felt powerless in a way he never had before. Every creak in the house, every shadow outside the window, seemed like a threat. The children's disappearance shook not just the family, but the entire small Indiana town. A community that had prided itself on familiarity and trust now faced a frightening question. Who could take 2 children from their own front yard? The investigation began in earnest. Officers interviewed neighbors, checked vehicles leaving the area, and scoured the surrounding forests. A dedicated tip line was established, with flyers distributed across the county and neighboring states. Local volunteers organized search parties, combing fields, abandoned barns, and even old mines in the area. Days became weeks, weeks became months, and yet the trail remained cold. The children seemed to have vanished completely. Robert Miller refused to succumb to despair. Each day he rose before dawn, mapping out every potential hiding place, checking old wells, riverbanks, and hidden paths, convinced that the children were somewhere waiting to be found. His routine was grueling, sometimes stretching into the early hours of the next morning. Linda, meanwhile, struggled with her own coping mechanisms, turning to her faith, lighting candles and praying incessantly for the safe return of Emily and Nathan. The house remained in a state of constant vigilance, the children's rooms untouched, toys still scattered, beds made every morning as if the children might walk in at any moment. The local community remained divided. While many supported the Millers tirelessly, some suggested moving on, holding memorials for children who might never return. Linda and Robert rejected such notions, insisting they would not mourn while hope remained. They organized neighborhood watch meetings, coordinated with law enforcement, and maintained public awareness through local media appearances. Over the years, their dedication became a symbol of unwavering parental love, a light of hope amid decades of uncertainty. Law enforcement faced challenges. The early 2000s lacked the advanced DNA and forensic tools that would later become critical in solving cold cases. Physical evidence was sparse. There was no crime scene, no eyewitnesses beyond vague accounts from neighbors, and no immediate leads pointing to a suspect. The case files grew thick with notes, dead-end interviews, and unverified tips. By 2005, the investigation had effectively stalled, with law enforcement forced to classify Emily and Nathan's disappearance as a cold case. Despite the lack of progress, Robert and Linda refused to stop searching. They maintained a network of volunteers, held annual vigils, and kept their children's faces in the public eye through local newspapers and television segments. Each year on the anniversary of the disappearance, the town paused to remember the children, renewing hope that answers would come. Technology would eventually provide the breakthrough that had eluded investigators for decades. By 2015, advances in DNA testing and forensic genealogy offered new tools. Cold case investigators revisited the Miller file, digitizing every page, every photograph, and every tip received since 2001. Hairs, fibers, and minute traces collected at the time were re-examined using methods unimaginable when the children vanished. The breakthrough came slowly, quietly, as a forensic lab in Indianapolis matched a DNA sample found on one recovered item with a database record, producing a suspect who had long avoided suspicion. The discovery shocked law enforcement and the community alike. The suspect, someone who had lived in the area in 2001 and was known to local authorities for minor offenses, had managed to remain under the radar for nearly 2 decades. Investigators began reconstructing movements, verifying alibis, and re-interviewing witnesses, many of whom had never considered the possibility that someone familiar could be responsible. The trail was finally heating up. As the investigation unfolded, details emerged that explained the frustrating dead ends of the past. The suspect had moved frequently, maintained a low profile, and exploited gaps in early 2000s investigative methods. Key evidence that might have been overlooked initially became crucial under modern forensic scrutiny. Every fiber, every trace, every previously ignored detail began to form a coherent narrative, pointing unambiguously to the individual now under intense scrutiny. By 2016, the case had grown in intensity. Detective Claire Reynolds, a specialist in cold cases with the Indiana State Police, took the lead. She was known for her methodical approach and patience in untangling years-old mysteries. When she first reviewed the Miller file, she was struck by the dedication of the family and the sheer volume of leads, tips, and interviews collected over 15 years. But she also noticed something that previous investigators had missed: a pattern in the timelines, a subtle connection between minor reports that, when combined, painted a clearer picture of the suspect's movements in 2001. Detective Reynolds coordinated with forensic genealogists and DNA analysts. The hairs collected from the children's play area, preserved meticulously by local police, were subjected to next-generation sequencing. What had once been inconclusive now yielded a partial genetic profile. Using genealogy databases, investigators identified distant relatives, which allowed them to narrow the search to a small group of potential suspects. This method, still new at the time, was transforming cold case investigations nationwide, turning long-forgotten evidence into actionable intelligence. The breakthrough came in late 2017. The DNA profile pointed to a man named Daniel Harris, 44 at the time of discovery, a former maintenance worker who had lived in the same neighborhood as the Millers in 2001. Harris had a criminal history limited to minor offenses, nothing violent. His previous interactions with law enforcement had been considered unremarkable, a man who blended into the community. Yet the DNA evidence now linked him directly to the scene. Investigators began to dig into his past, constructing a detailed timeline. Harris had left Indiana for a neighboring state shortly after the children disappeared, a move that had gone largely unnoticed. Interviews with former neighbors revealed little about his daily habits. Though some recalled odd behavior, disappearing for hours during the day, appearing unusually interested in the children, and being quick to offer unsolicited assistance to their family. These small details, harmless at the time, now painted a troubling picture. In early 2018, authorities secured search warrants for Harris's current residence. Inside, they discovered items that had remained untouched for nearly 2 decades. Clothing with trace fibers matching those found at the Miller property, personal journals referencing the children, and notes detailing local streets and neighborhood routines. The evidence was meticulous, organized, and chilling, suggesting premeditation and a deep fixation on Emily and Nathan. Meanwhile, the Miller family had continued their private vigil. Linda had grown frail over the years, her hair now streaked with grey, but she remained resolute. Each holiday, each birthday without Emily and Nathan reinforced her determination. Robert, once robust and energetic, had aged rapidly under the weight of grief and relentless searching. The discovery that Harris had been connected to their children's disappearance brought a mix of hope and terror. Would he finally be caught, or had decades of life moved him beyond reach? Detective Reynolds's team meticulously prepared the case for arrest. Every detail mattered. The DNA matches, Harris's journals, witness recollections, and digital evidence showing his movements. They coordinated with the Federal Cold Case Task Force to ensure that every legal procedure was followed. The stakes were high. The case had already captured the attention of the national media, and a wrongful arrest could devastate both the family and the credibility of the investigators. Finally, in April 2018, a tactical team approached Harris's home at dawn. The man who had eluded justice for 17 years was taken into custody quietly, without incident. The news spread quickly. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the Miller family dared to hope. The community, still haunted by the children's disappearance, rallied around the family. Neighbors who had once avoided discussing the tragedy came forward to express relief, sorrow, and a shared sense of justice. The investigation continued, now shifting from the arrest to the preparation for trial. Forensic experts re-examined all evidence, ensuring that everything would withstand scrutiny in court. Psychological profilers contributed insight into Harris's behavior, explaining the patterns of obsession and secrecy that had allowed him to evade detection for so long. Law enforcement recognized the role that both modern technology and patient detective work played in finally uncovering the truth. For the Millers, the journey was intensely personal. Each day brought a mix of relief, sorrow, and anticipation. Linda and Robert visited the courthouse regularly, reviewing procedural updates and meeting with victim advocates. They wrestled with emotions long buried, fear that their children's final years had been marked by suffering, grief that no punishment could erase what had happened, and a small but persistent spark of hope that the truth might finally give them peace. By mid-2018, the prosecutors had built a compelling case. The narrative was clear. Daniel Harris had observed, planned, and executed the abduction, concealing the children in a hidden location nearby. DNA evidence, corroborated by physical traces and witness testimony, created an irrefutable link. Journals and detailed notes found in Harris's home demonstrated his premeditation and awareness of the consequences of his actions. The files that had once seemed like dead ends now formed a coherent, undeniable story. Community interest surged as media coverage intensified. Local news outlets ran daily updates, interviews with detectives, and pieces on the Miller family's perseverance. Social media platforms buzzed with public speculation and support, many expressing outrage that Harris had lived for years without consequence. The story became a symbol of both the dangers that can hide in plain sight and the power of modern forensic technology to bring long-delayed justice. As the trial date approached, Linda and Robert prepared themselves for a grueling emotional ordeal. Facing the man responsible for their children's disappearance meant confronting pain they had carried for 17 years. They sought counseling and support, determined to endure the proceedings not for vengeance, but to finally achieve closure and public acknowledgement of the suffering they had endured. The trial began on a crisp September morning in 2018. For the Miller family, each step toward the courthouse was both a triumph and a torment. 17 years of unanswered questions had led to this moment, and yet the weight of reliving the trauma was almost unbearable. Linda clutched Robert's arm as they entered the courtroom, their faces lined with decades of worry and sleepless nights. The courtroom was packed. Media, law enforcement, community members, and observers from across the state had gathered. Everyone wanted to witness history being made. The prosecution opened with a somber but precise narrative of the events surrounding Emily and Nathan's disappearance. They described the children's last known movements, the painstaking investigation that followed, and the years of unresolved anguish suffered by the Miller family. The attorney emphasized how modern forensic techniques had finally provided irrefutable links between Harris and the crime. Every piece of evidence, from the DNA traces to the journals found in Harris's home, was presented to paint a clear picture for the jury. Forensic experts took the stand to explain how old evidence, long overlooked, could now be examined with unprecedented precision. Dr. Michael Gaines, a specialist in genetic genealogy, detailed how partial DNA profiles were cross-referenced with public databases to identify familial connections, eventually pointing investigators to Harris. He described how tiny fibers, soil samples and trace materials that had been collected nearly 2 decades earlier now provided compelling proof of Harris's presence at the scene and his deliberate actions. Former neighbors and witnesses were brought in to recount small but telling observations from 2001. One neighbor remembered seeing Harris loitering near the Miller home on the morning of the disappearance, claiming he was checking the yard for maintenance issues, though no such responsibilities were assigned to him that day. Another recalled his unusual curiosity about the children's routines, his questions polite but insistent, and his tendency to linger in the area longer than necessary. Each recollection, while seemingly minor at the time, collectively built the case against him. The defense strategy relied heavily on Harris's age and the argument that no physical evidence conclusively proved murder beyond a reasonable doubt. They suggested that the DNA and fibers might have been coincidental, that the journals could be misinterpreted, and that the timeline was circumstantial. Harris himself remained stoic throughout the proceedings, sitting silently through testimony and refusing to show emotion or remorse. He did not take the stand, and no additional witnesses were presented on his behalf. One of the most emotionally charged moments came when the prosecution introduced the children's belongings recovered from a storage unit Harris had used after leaving Indiana. Old toys, school books, and personal items, preserved almost perfectly over the years, were displayed in the courtroom. Linda's hands trembled as she recognized Emily's favorite storybook, worn from countless readings. Robert's eyes welled with tears at the sight of Nathan's baseball glove, still bearing the faint scuff marks from their backyard games. For the Millers, these items were tangible reminders of lives stolen too soon. Throughout the trial, the courtroom atmosphere was heavy with tension. Every word, every piece of evidence brought decades of grief to the forefront. Journalists described the scenes as quietly devastating, noting the resilience of the Miller family in the face of such overwhelming emotional strain. Members of the community attended daily, some taking notes, others simply sitting silently, grappling with the realization that the horror had occurred so close to home. Hidden in plain sight for nearly 20 years, the prosecution meticulously laid out Harris's premeditation. Journals found in his home revealed detailed notes about the neighborhood, the children's routines and methods to avoid detection. Entries indicated knowledge of the area's blind spots, and calculations suggested he had planned not only the abduction, but also the concealment of evidence in a location few would suspect. Forensic evidence corroborated these notes, linking fibers from the children's clothing to Harris's residence and his vehicle. Advanced DNA testing confirmed the partial profiles obtained years earlier, now matching Harris with near certainty. Experts in child psychology and criminology explained the behavioral patterns that allowed Harris to integrate so seamlessly into the community while committing such acts. Dr. Elizabeth Chambers testified about the type of predator who can appear ordinary, even helpful, while harboring dangerous intentions. Her testimony emphasized that Harris's outwardly mundane life, maintenance worker, quiet neighbor, volunteer, was a textbook example of how predators can hide in plain sight. Community members were called to testify about the lingering impact of the children's disappearance. Teachers, friends, and neighbors spoke about the sense of unease that had pervaded the neighborhood for years. A former principal described the ripple effect on local schools, explaining that children who had been Emily and Nathan's peers remained affected by their absence. Their disappearance was not just a family tragedy, it had scarred an entire community. The defense attempted to discredit the timeline, suggesting that Harris could not have committed the abduction given certain work records. However, investigators produced corroborating evidence, including travel logs, receipts, and digital records, demonstrating that Harris's movements aligned precisely with the critical time frame. Each objection by the defense was countered with meticulous documentation, leaving the jury with little room for doubt. Perhaps the most poignant moment came during the victim impact statements. Linda and Robert spoke softly, but with incredible strength, addressing Harris directly. Linda's voice trembled as she said, "For 17 years we have carried the weight of not knowing. Every birthday, every holiday, every quiet evening at home was shadowed by your actions. Today we are not asking for vengeance, only for the truth to be acknowledged, and for justice to finally be served." Robert, holding Linda's hand, added, "We did everything we could to find Emily and Nathan. You may have tried to hide the truth, but it has been revealed. You cannot take away our memories, our love, or our hope for closure." The jury deliberated for only a few hours, overwhelmed by the clarity of the evidence and the consistency of the testimonies. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of subdued relief and quiet sobbing. For the Millers, the word guilty did not erase the pain, but it provided the first sense of resolution in nearly 2 decades. Sentencing followed shortly thereafter, the judge acknowledging the premeditation, the years of pain endured by the family, and the meticulous efforts to conceal the crime, sentenced Harris to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He would spend the remainder of his life in prison, a tangible reminder that even decades later justice could prevail. Outside the courthouse, members of the community gathered, some placing flowers at a memorial set up in honor of Emily and Nathan. The media captured the emotional release, the tears, and the quiet celebrations of a family finally validated. Detective Claire Reynolds, though reserved, allowed herself a brief smile. Her tireless work, the re-examination of evidence, and the use of modern forensic techniques had brought an end to a story that had haunted Indiana for nearly 20 years. The Millers, though forever changed by their loss, began to rebuild parts of their lives. Linda returned home, focusing on establishing a foundation in Emily and Nathan's names to support missing children and cold case investigations. Robert dedicated himself to speaking with law enforcement and community groups, emphasizing the importance of perseverance, observation, and never dismissing small details. The case inspired neighboring counties to re-examine their own unresolved disappearances, highlighting the power of persistence, technology, and unwavering commitment to justice. The Indiana 2001 cold case became a model nationwide. Law enforcement agencies studied how proper evidence preservation, genealogical databases, and advanced DNA testing could solve cases long thought unsolvable. Communities learned the importance of vigilance, reporting suspicious activity, and supporting families through prolonged investigations. Most importantly, the story of Emily and Nathan Miller served as a testament to human resilience, the enduring power of hope, and the ultimate triumph of justice. Even after 17 years, in the months following Harris's sentencing, the Miller family's lives began a slow and tentative shift. The heavy weight of uncertainty that had dominated nearly 2 decades was finally lifted, but the absence of Emily and Nathan remained an unfillable void. Linda often found herself walking through the empty rooms of their home, pausing at the places where the children had once laughed, played, and shared their thoughts. Each object, each corner, held memories frozen in time. She kept a small box in the living room, containing their favorite toys, drawings and photographs, items that were now sacred relics of a life stolen too soon. Robert, despite the relief that justice had been achieved, struggled with the physical toll of years of worry and sleepless nights. He developed new health concerns that doctors attributed in part to prolonged stress and grief. Yet he remained determined to turn the family's tragedy into a source of hope for others. He began giving talks at local schools and community centers about the importance of vigilance and the role ordinary citizens play in aiding law enforcement. His message was clear: even when the odds seem insurmountable, persistence and attention to detail can make a difference. The Miller family also focused on creating a foundation in the children's names, dedicated to supporting cold case investigations and assisting families of missing children. The foundation provided grants for advanced forensic testing, offered scholarships for students pursuing criminal justice careers, and partnered with law enforcement agencies to develop community outreach programs. Linda described the work as a way to honor Emily and Nathan, and to ensure that no other family endures the uncertainty we faced for 17 long years. Community members in Indiana also took steps to acknowledge the impact of the case and the lessons it offered. A small memorial park was established near the neighborhood where the children had lived, featuring a pair of engraved benches and a statue symbolizing hope and resilience. Annual remembrance events brought together families affected by similar tragedies, law enforcement officials, and volunteers from the Miller Foundation. These gatherings provided a space for healing, reflection, and renewed commitment to public safety. The Miller family's journey also brought about reconciliation with the past. Linda and Robert made efforts to reconnect with friends and neighbors who had distanced themselves during the years of uncertainty. They discovered that many people had carried silent guilt for not noticing warning signs or questioning seemingly minor details. Together, the community worked to transform that guilt into positive action, reporting suspicious activity, volunteering for child safety programs, and participating in neighborhood watch initiatives. Law enforcement agencies nationwide studied the Miller case as an example of how persistence, coupled with evolving technology, could crack cases long thought unsolvable. Detective Claire Reynolds and her team received recognition for their work, demonstrating how modern forensic methods, especially DNA testing and genealogical analysis, could finally bring closure to cold cases. Departments across the country began re-examining old evidence, creating digital databases, and forming specialized cold case units. The media coverage of the trial and aftermath also had a profound impact. Stories of Emily and Nathan's disappearance, the tireless search by their family, and the eventual capture of Harris were featured in national news outlets. Documentaries, podcasts, and articles explored the intricate details of the investigation, emphasizing the importance of persistence, collaboration, and community involvement. While the attention was intense, it also provided a platform for advocacy, highlighting the need for proper evidence preservation and ongoing training for investigators. For Linda and Robert, the emotional aftermath was complex. They experienced relief, grief, and even moments of guilt, questioning whether they could have done more sooner. Counseling and support groups became crucial for navigating these emotions. Family therapy sessions, sometimes joined by